Hey everyone, my name is Sean Cecil from the Oculus Institute. And today we're going to go to the third video in our internal work series where we're going to talk about NLP, Neurolinguistic Programming. Okay, so if you have had any experience in personal development courses, chances are that you have done some form of the NLP school of work. So NLP stands for Neurolinguistic Programming. It was created by I think Doctors Grinder and Bandler back, I believe, in the 70s. I'm not sure. But it started to become really popular in the 80s. And the person who did the most to popularize NLP was a man named Tony Robbins. Still around. He's considered to be, probably the most famous person in the personal development space, in the coaching space. I mean, you guys watching the video may have even, read some of his books or done some of his programs or something along those lines. But because he has been so dominant, I mean, he really rose very high in the 80s, and he's been around for several decades. He's had a lot of people who have worked for him and who have learned these concepts, or even people who never worked for him who studied his work, studied his books, studied this stuff, and then applied some of these concepts. And so most coaches in the personal development space use NLP to some extent. How much of that they do, whether they do kind of, the more surface level stuff or some of the more technical stuff will vary a lot. But you can basically class NLP into 5 different groups. And just fair warning, unlike some of my other categorizations, this one's may not be fully comprehensively exhaustive because NLP is an incredibly broad field and people have attached that label to many things. But looking at it from these 5 perspectives will be helpful. So the first perspective is what I'm going to call the psycholinguistic perspective. So this is looking at how different choices of words affect your internal architecture in terms of, your beliefs and your decision-making process and your prevailing assumptions and all these things that happen in the subconscious, right? The words that you use can have a big impact. So for example, if somebody says, "I'm a failure," that has a very different effect than "I failed at this task," right? Because one's about an identity, right? And one is about, this is an event that happened in the past, right? One could also frame that and say, hey, listen, I did not hit the quantitative target that I was supposed to hit on this task. Now you can see on that one, right? That's different than saying failed in terms of the amount of emotional charge that's there. Those are the kinds of things that you see with psycholinguistics. Also included in psycholinguistics are things like conversational hypnosis. So people can use, pauses and things to kind of like implant stuff in the subconscious. That tends not to be nearly as effective as people think it is. It can help in certain marginal cases, and it can help with people who are very susceptible to it, or people who willingly enter into like a state to do hypnosis. But it's not something that can really be used on people unintentionally to the extent that popular culture has said it is. Now, the next category is what I'm going to call the neuroplasticity-based category. So this is about how your brain forms connections and intentionally affecting the neural architecture. So one thing that's in here is something called anchors, where you can create a certain amount of emotional charge or certain associations and linkages in the brain with a particular thing, right? So for example, you can, like bend your thumb this way whenever you want to be courageous or whatever. And if time comes for courage, you can, hand under the table, you can bend your thumb and step into your courage dynamic there, right? So, creating associations, stuff like that. There's a tool that I have my clients use, for example, if they want to repattern a specific, thought pattern or behavioral pattern, where they kind of identify the chain of thought and they identify like one of the early triggers, and then they build this really strong association with something that does not lead them down the path they want to avoid, that leads them down the opposite path, and they build an association from that to something else. And you can, if you just put the time into just creating that association by, creating a certain amount of focus of alternating between them with, emotion and everything, then it literally just hardwires your brain differently, right? Neurons that fire together wire together. This is documented, right? And so you can kind of force the brain to create these neural links and do some programming around yourself. Now, the third category of NLP, and this is one of the most useful, is something called meta programs. So metaprograms are like fundamentally like, how do you perceive the world, right? So for example, do you play yourself movies in your head, or do you tell yourself stories, or do you go off of feeling? Those things might seem not that important to people, but they're linked to all kinds of other things. They're linked to things like, do you primarily move towards your goals or move away from pain? They're linked to things like, do you match other people? Like, are you inclined to agree with other people? Or do you mismatch other people? Are you inclined to disagree with other people, right? Just yesterday, I was talking to somebody who, everything I said, it was either no or it was yes, but, right? So this guy was like a serial mismatcher. And some people might get really offended by that. They might be like, oh man, this person's just disagreeable. But I know it's just NLP, like that's just the way this guy thinks, right? Like that's just how he operates. He's a mismatcher, and that's okay, right? If you start clustering some of these meta programs together, you can end up getting these, because there's correlations between them. You can get things like the DISC psychometric, right? Which is an incredibly powerful psychometric that I use with my clients. All that kind of stuff falls under meta programs. The fourth category in the NLP bucket, the fourth toolbox, is belief work. Now, belief work can be about yourself, in which case it would be identity-based beliefs. It can be about the world, it can be about specific situations, but fundamentally beliefs are either going to be empowering, which means they move you towards your values, they're going to be neutral, or they're going to be disempowering, which means they hold you back from your values. Now, many people who are trained in the NLP school will do belief work in such a way where they just try to eliminate disempowering beliefs, even if those beliefs are true, which I find to be very problematic. My approach is, if a disempowering belief is true, you can't just ignore it, right? Like, you can't diverse yourself from reality. So in those cases, I look for a way to make it irrelevant, right? Find a situation where it doesn't apply, or find a way to change the game, or whatever, right? It's like, a good example is like, I used to have a webinar that didn't convert at all. I wouldn't say, oh, well, I'm just going to believe my webinar is converting. I was like, no, I'm going to change the webinar. I'm going to improve the webinar. And then the fact that the old webinar doesn't convert is utterly irrelevant, because now I have a new webinar, right? So that's kind of how I approach belief work. But definitely the identity-based beliefs are probably going to be the most bang for your buck in that arena. And then finally, we get to values. And values is about what's important to you. So values, can be about the person who you choose to be, right? What components of your identity are you selecting, right? It can be about the experiences that you want to have. I know that, Tony Robbins has 3 different, paired values where each one's opposite of the other, right? So it's like, variety versus stability and stuff like that. I personally prefer to use a much broader, much wider self-generated list that's not constrained by any kind of pre-created architecture. But getting clear on what you really want in this world is super powerful. The big problem with the values work is that very often people who have not done suitable, deconditioning and inner work beforehand will either start bringing in other people's values, aka inauthentic values, or they'll be moving away from fear-based values. And if you really want to create a values totem pole that's really going to point you in the right direction, you want to have authentic values that are not based in fear. And really, to get there requires some serious deconditioning. And that is the focus of the last internal school that I'm going to talk about, which is the esoteric work. Hey everyone, if you found this video valuable, if you found a new perspective that's going to help you in your career or in your personal development, then I've got one more free gift for you. I've put together a free diagnostic quiz to help you figure out exactly where you are on the path to career freedom and what you need to do next. Just a few short multiple choice questions, and you're going to get a rating of where you stand in terms of your career fulfillment. How is your job affecting you? How much does it align with who you naturally are? With your financial success, and with your internal alignment, your own sense of inner peace, and how that plays out in your life. Additionally, it will also show you which toolboxes are going to help you achieve higher levels in the ratings that were most challenging for you, as well as what next steps you can take to make sure that you gain those skills and you get the rewards. So if you want to go take that quiz, just go to www.oculusinstitute.com/purposequiz. No lines, no spaces, no dashes, just www.oculusinstitute.com/purposequiz. I'm looking forward to seeing your results. I hope you get a lot out of it, and I'm looking forward to helping you take those next steps.